everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new Mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about a solved case from the northeast of England when a young mother of one just mysteriously disappeared one night in late 1989 and was later found horrifically murdered. Pretty quickly, the man suspected of killing her was identified by the police and arrested, but tragically, following his extensive court proceedings, he was acquitted and was able to walk free, having gotten away with murder. And because of an 800-year-old law, he was able to just continue with his life as normal, safe in the knowledge that he could never go to trial again for the heinous crime he had committed, despite the admissions of guilt he would make to various people following his acquittal. But thanks to the victim's own mum, this twisted predator would not get the last laugh. This is the story of a mother who refused to give up the fight for justice, who refused to let her daughter's killer get away with what he had done. A mother who decided that she was going to do everything in her power to change the law and make British history. This is the story of Julie Hogg. But just quickly before we get into the case, please listen carefully to the following. This video contains heavy themes such as rape and sexual assault, and the topic of animal cruelty is also briefly mentioned. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back nearly 3.5 decades now to November of 1989 in Billingham, which is a town located in County Durham in the northeast of England. And this is Julie Hogg. She was a 22-year-old woman who lived in Billingham. Julie was born on the 22nd of February 1967 to her parents Charlie and Anne Ming, and she was one of 3 children. She was the middle child of 3 kids. She had an older brother named Gary and a younger sister named Angela, and it would appear as though Julie and her siblings had a very normal, happy childhood for the time. As a kid, Julie was described as being quite quiet. Her mother Anne said that Julie was definitely the most shy out of her 3 kids. I think she was a bit more of an introvert type, and she always kind of had a small group of friends growing up rather than loads and loads of friends, but the friends that she did have, she was very, very close to. She was very well behaved, never really caused any problems for her parents, although Anne Ming did recall how once Julie hit the terrible teenage years, this changed slightly. She was a bit of a moody young girl. I feel like every single girl does go through that though, don't they? At some point in their teens, that kind of cranky phase where you have a lot of mood swings because, you know, you're going through puberty, you're getting this influx of hormones. So yeah, she was a bit of a moody teenager, but she also became very adventurous, it seems, with her fashion and kind of sense of style. Whilst Julie could be quite timid and shy in terms of her personality, she found a way to express herself more through her clothing. Her mum Anne said that she started dressing kind of like a rebel. She wouldn't follow and copy what everyone else was wearing at the time. Julie would wear more flamboyant kind of clothes and outfits. She'd wear really bright tops and high heels and stuff like that. At one point she went through a punk rock phase. Another time she went through a Boy George phase where she would dress like him and style her hair to look like his. She just loved that kind of thing. She loved putting different outfits together, and she always tried to leave the house looking her best. Julie was also described as being a very feisty young woman. Although she was a bit shy, she was also very, very headstrong in the sense that if she thought she was right about something during an argument, she would always stand her ground. She didn't let people walk all over her. She was also said to have been very loyal, and she had a good sense of humour, with her mum noting how Julie had, quote, an infectious giggle that bubbled out at inappropriate moments. Shortly after Julie left high school, when she was 16 years old, she met the man who would go on to become her husband, a man named Andrew Hogg. Andrew was also from Billingham, and the two of them met at a local youth club, and they hit it off, started dating, and in 1985, when Julie was around 18, they married, and Julie Ming became Julie Hogg. And Julie's family approved of this marriage. They really liked Andrew. They thought that he was very kind of easygoing and relaxed, and he and Julie seemed like a good match. The newlyweds moved into a house located on Grange Avenue in Billingham, and literally just a couple of months after they married, Julie discovered that she was pregnant. And in 1986, she gave birth to a little little boy who she and Andrew named Kevin. So now they were a little family of 3. However, it was after Kevin arrived when it appeared as though the relationship between Andrew and Julie was on the rocks. They just started bickering and arguing a lot over many different things, and Julie's mother Anne said that Julie and Andrew were both as bad as each other when it came to their disagreement. It wasn't like it was one-sided. They would both do things to annoy and anger the other one. She said that they could both be quite immature. I mean, they were both very young. You know, Julie was only 18 when they married and fell pregnant, and I think Andrew was just a couple of years older. So they had to adjust to this new life as parents when they were barely even adults themselves, really. And it would appear as though they just got to the point where they kind of just started to drift apart from one another, and so eventually they decided to separate. And not too long after their separation in 1989, Andrew actually relocated to London. He got a job in London, which is pretty far. It's a good like 5.5 hours away from County Durham. But as far as I'm aware, he still planned to maintain regular contact with their son Kevin, who by this point, by 1989, was around 3 years old. And by the time this case occurred, Julie and Andrew had plans to start their court proceedings for a legal separation. In fact, that happens to be exactly what Julie intended to do on the day that she suddenly disappeared. It was Wednesday the 15th of November 1989, and that afternoon Julie's mother Anne arrived at her daughter's house on Grange Avenue, as Anne had agreed to look after little Kevin for the night. Due to the fact that Julie had a late shift at her work that evening, she worked for this local pizza restaurant as a pizza delivery driver. So yeah, that afternoon Anne picked up Kevin, and Julie reminded her mum to give her a phone call the next morning to make sure that she was awake. You see, the next day Julie planned to go to court to apply for her legal separation from Andrew. I believe her appointment was around like 10 a.m. or she wanted to get there for 10. So she asked her mum to ring her at 7:30 to make sure that she was up, and then Anne was going to take her to the appointment. So she was going to pick her daughter up at around 9 a.m. So Anne took her grandson Kevin back to her house. Later that night, Julie went and did her evening shift at the pizza shop, and when her shift ended in the early hours of the morning on the 16th of November, Julie was dropped back to her house by one of her colleagues, and this colleague recalled watching Julie as she walked up to her front door and used her key to unlock it. This was around 1:30 a.m. So it seemed as though she was in for the night. She would probably go straight to bed because she knew she would have to be up early the next morning. However, the next morning rolled around, it got to 7:30 a.m. and as promised, Anne Ming picked up the phone and tried to call Julie, but she got no response. Julie didn't answer the phone. Now, Anne didn't really think much of this at first. She just assumed that Julie was still sleeping, as she'd obviously had a late night working, so was likely very tired. And so she just left it for about 15 minutes or so before trying to call again. But once again, when she did phone, there was no answer. And so she put Kevin into the car and drove straight to Julie's house. But when she arrived, the front door was locked and Julie wasn't answering. And one thing that Anne immediately noticed was that all of the curtains were closed, as if, again, Julie hadn't even woken up yet. Anne went round to the back of the house to knock on Julie's back door, but again, she had no luck. And she was shouting Julie's name, but there was just nothing. She could hear no noise coming from inside of the house. Eventually, Anne decided to go and grab her son, Julie's older brother Gary, because he was working nearby. And I think Anne was panicking a little bit at this point, so she just wanted someone to help her come and get inside of Julie's house, because who knows, maybe something had happened to her inside. Maybe she'd had an accident and was injured and couldn't get to the phone or the door herself. So Gary went to Grange Avenue with his mum. He actually smashed this glass panel by the back door to get in. However, once Gary did get inside, he ran round the whole house and there was no sign of Julie. She wasn't in there. But what seemed really, really strange about the house was that it was unusually tidy. Julie was normally quite a messy person, especially when she was getting ready in the morning. She wasn't really one to make her bed as soon as she woke up. She would just kind of leave it for later. She would normally leave her clothes and her makeup lying lying around where she had been getting ready to leave the house. However, there was none of that. It was all very neat and tidy, which was bizarre because, as I said, she wasn't in the house. She had clearly gone somewhere, but then why wasn't there the usual mess that she would leave before she left the house, you know? Something about this whole situation just was not making sense, and alarm bells had started to ring for both Gary and Anne, and so it was then when Anne decided to contact the police and report her daughter as missing. However, the police were not very helpful at all, to say the least, when Anne made this report. They basically said to her, it's too soon to file the missing persons report. She's not been missing for long enough, so they told Anne to just wait for a while longer and see if Julie turns up or if she gets in contact. But of course, Anne could not just wait. She couldn't just sit around and do nothing whilst her daughter was potentially in trouble somewhere. And so she and the rest of the family began reaching out to Julie's friends, asking if she was with any of them. Of course she wasn't. They also contacted her co-workers at the pizza restaurant, and that was when they learned from one co-worker that Julie had returned home the previous night. They dropped her back to her house at around 1:30 in the morning, and they watched her put her keys in the front door. But despite the fact that no one in her life had seen or heard from Julie since then, still the police were not taking this report very seriously at all. One police officer even said to Anne, well, Julie probably went out drinking to a nightclub or something after her shift at the pizza shop ended, which Anne knew was just absurd. That was not something that Julie would have done. She knew that she had to get up early for her appointment at court the next day, so there's no way that she would have done that. Anne just knew in her gut that something had happened to her daughter. It was like mother's intuition. But the police just would not listen. Another officer even alleged that Julie may have decided to just start a new life somewhere. Maybe she'd gone to London or something for a fresh start and just wanted to be left alone. They assumed that she just moved away and left her 3-year-old son behind. I mean, what the hell? It wasn't until several days after Julie disappeared when finally the police actually decided to act. So as we know, Julie disappeared sometime in the early hours of the 16th of November. Well, that was when she was last seen by her co-worker at her front door, and that was the Thursday. And it wasn't until the following Monday when detectives decided to actually do something. They decided to send a forensics team in to search Julie's house on Grange Avenue because, as I just said, we know that that was the last place she was seen. So if something bad had happened to her, it likely would have happened in that house. So the forensics team was sent in, they conducted their search, and whilst the search was underway, actually, Julie's mother, Anne, rang Julie's house phone to ask the police who were there if they had found anything of significance yet, to which the officer who picked up the phone responded saying, quote, well, there's no dead bodies in here, if that's what you mean, which of course made Anne incredibly upset and angry. I mean, how insensitive of that police officer to make a comment like that. Anne was already hysterical, worrying about what had happened to Julie, so for the officer to make a remark like that is just disgusting. Honestly, the police work in the beginning of this case is just pretty shameful in my opinion. Eventually, the forensic search came to an end with the police finding nothing. They didn't find anything in the house to indicate what might have happened to Julie Hogg. In fact, the detective even said to Anne, quote, I can't guarantee you that something hasn't happened to your daughter somewhere in the country, but I can guarantee you that nothing untoward happened to her inside that house. They did not believe that any harm had come to Julie inside of the house. They found no signs of a struggle or any blood or anything. So still it was a complete mystery what had happened to Julie, where she had gone. Anne and the family made several TV appeals in which they pleaded for anyone with any information regarding Julie's whereabouts to come forward. Julie's case was in the newspapers and police conducted door-to-door inquiries, but there was nothing, no news. And soon days without Julie turned into weeks and weeks turned into months. Christmas of 1989 passed by and Julie's family had to spend it devastated with still no idea as to what had happened to her. And what's so heartbreaking is that they still all bought presents for Julie and put them under the Christmas tree just in the hopes that maybe she would turn up on Christmas Day, but of course she didn't. There was just nothing, no developments in the case whatsoever. The police just didn't really have any anything to go on, or at least that was until early 1990, when in a truly shocking turn of events, Anne Ming made a horrifying discovery. She found something that no mother should ever have to find. She found her own daughter's dead body. Around the end of January / beginning of February of 1990, Julie's ex-husband Andrew Hogg decided that he was going to go to his old house on Grange Avenue, the house that he obviously used to share with Julie, and he was going to start cleaning it. Now, the house had obviously remained empty and sealed off for the last few months whilst the police continued with their inquiries into Julie's disappearance, but by the end of January, Andrew had been given the keys back and he had decided that he was going to move back into the house with his and Julie's son Kevin. So yeah, like I said, Andrew went into the house to begin cleaning up and just getting the house sorted. He put the central heating on because it was obviously winter time and freezing, and whilst he was in there, he noticed this horrible smell in the house, specifically coming from the bathroom. There was just this awful smell in the upstairs bathroom, and so he called Julie's mum Anne to tell her about it, and Anne just assumed that it was the toilet. She said to Andrew, oh well, the toilet obviously hasn't been used in months, so it probably would smell. So she told him to just put some bleach down the toilet and leave it for a little while. So he did just that. However, a couple of days passed and Andrew told Anne that the smell still hadn't gone. In fact, he said, if anything, it's just getting worse and worse. And so Anne decided to investigate this smell coming from the bathroom herself, and as soon as she started walking up the stairs in Julie's house towards the bathroom, the smell instantly hit her, and straight away she recognized the scent of, well, I guess decomposition. You see, Anne worked as a nurse, and she had done for decades. She'd worked in operating theatres and stuff, and she knew all too well what this smell was. This wasn't a dirty toilet. Something was decomposing upstairs in the bathroom, and all Anne could think to herself as she was walking upstairs was, please God, don't let it be Julie, don't let it be Julie. As Anne walked into the bathroom, initially she didn't notice anything kind of out of place, but she started looking around. She looked behind the sink and the toilet for the source of the smell. She couldn't find anything, but at one point Anne leaned over the bathtub to again sniff around. She was sniffing up against the wall, and as she did, her knees were leaning against the bath panel, and where the bath panel was clearly loose, the pressure from Anne's knees caused a gap to open up, and as soon as this gap was open, the smell grew even stronger. It was now so intense and almost overwhelming. The source of this smell was clearly coming from underneath the bath. So Anne knelt down, she pulled back the panel and she peered inside, and she saw what she knew instantly was a dead body wrapped up in a blanket, and she just knew that it was Julie. Anne immediately started screaming. She screamed for Andrew downstairs, telling him she's under the bath, she's under the bath, and within minutes police arrived at the scene, and sure enough, it was Julie's decomposing body underneath the bathtub. She'd been lying there dead and undiscovered underneath the bath for months, ever since she went missing. She was under the bath when police had a forensics team search that house, and they didn't find her. How on earth they didn't find her is just beyond me. It's just awful that of all people, Julie's own mother had to make that horrific discovery. A mother finding her own child's decomposing body is just insane. I can't imagine the trauma that must have left Anne with, honestly. Of course, Anne Ming launched a complaint against the Cleveland police for how terrible they had been pretty much throughout the investigation so far. From refusing to take Julie's case seriously right from the very start to literally missing her dead body in the house, despite a full forensic team being sent in to search. And apparently Julie's family were given about £10,000 in compensation, and Anne and her husband Charlie were given a further £15,000 from the Criminal Injuries Compensation Compensation Authority for the PTSD that Anne was left with as a result of finding her daughter's body and the depression that Julie's father Charlie suffered. I personally think that they should have been given much more than that, much more than 10 grand in compensation, but I mean really no amount of money would have made up for the shambles of the police investigation, would it? So now what was a missing persons case had turned into a murder inquiry. It was obvious that foul play was involved here, given the fact that someone had literally hidden Julie's body underneath the bath, hoping that she would never be found clearly. Of course, one of the very first people that the police looked into as a suspect was Julie's ex-husband, Andrew. He was immediately taken in for questioning, but was ultimately ruled out. It was clear that he was not involved in Julie's death. And so the hunt for the real killer commenced, and as part of their investigation, the police sent the blanket that Julie's body was wrapped in off for forensic examination. And it was during this examination when fibres were found on the blanket. Now, what the police would eventually conclude was that these fibres seemed to match these rugby shirts that the men who played for the Billingham Rugby Football Club would wear. So this gave the police their first clue, their first big lead. Could these fibres mean that Julie's killer was someone who played for or went to the Billingham Rugby Club? So they began looking into the members of the club, and they quickly identified this gang of men who were part of the club and who called themselves the Crazy Gang, or at least that's what they were known as to the locals because of the kind of stuff that they would get up to. Apparently they were known as this group of rowdy, often drunk men, and they would often do things like hire strippers and have them perform for the men at the rugby club when there were stag do's and parties, etc. From what I can gather, these men, the Crazy Gang, had a bit of a reputation around Billingham, and so the police decided that they were going to bring in every single member for questioning, and slowly, one by one, they were ruling each of them out as being Julie's killer, all except one man. There was one member of this gang that the police could not eliminate and who seemed to stand out from the rest. His name was Billy Dunlop. So just for a bit of extra information about him, Billy Dunlop was born in March of 1963, meaning that he would have been around 26 years old at the time of Julie's murder, so he was around 4 years older than her. He came from a family of 4 and he grew up in County Durham, so he had lived there his whole life. And according to a documentary that I watched about this case, Billy grew up in a pretty abusive household. His father was very, very physically abusive. He would often resort to using violence to discipline his kids, and clearly this aggression from his father influenced him to behave in the same way. Billy Dunlop also grew up to become a very, very aggressive and short-tempered individual who was often in trouble with the police. When he was just 18, he was arrested for literally kicking a man in the face, and he'd also committed other assaults. There had even been a rumour going around in Billingham about him at one point, about how he had literally cut off a dog's head with a knife. Whether this rumour was actually true or not, we don't know, but by the time this case occurred, he really had built up this reputation in Billingham as being a very volatile man who was quick to anger and would become violent at any moment if he felt like he was provoked in some way. A lot of people in Billingham feared Billy Dunlop, and it turns out that Billy Dunlop was no stranger to Julie Hogg. I'm not sure exactly when it was that they met, but apparently they came to meet because they had mutual friends in Billingham, and so they became sort of friendly themselves. And sources state that he and Julie had a bit of a sexual relationship at one point. Some articles seem to refer to Julie as his ex-girlfriend, but I don't think she was. I don't think they ever properly dated. I think they just had a bit of a fling, like a one-night stand, following Julie's split from her husband Andrew. But Julie wasn't interested in pursuing things any further with Billy. It's been speculated that in fact after they hooked up, she was actually a little bit scared of him. So I wonder what he must have done during their encounter to make her feel this way. And it turns out that at the time of Julie's murder, Billy Dunlop was living literally just around the corner from Julie's house on Grange Avenue. I think he was renting a room in a house off of a friend of his named Don. So because of all of this because of the fact that Billy Dunlop was a member of the Billingham Rugby Club whose shirts matched the fibres found on the blanket that Julie's body had been wrapped in, the fact that he lived just around the corner, the fact that he had had some kind of relationship with Julie before, and of course not forgetting the fact that he was a very violent individual, Billy Dunlop quickly rose to the very top of the suspect list for the detectives. So the police began trying to piece together his movements on the night in question, the night that Julie was killed, to work out whether he would have had opportunity to carry out this crime. And in doing so, what they discovered was that the evening before Julie went missing, so on the evening of the 15th of November, whilst obviously Julie was working her shift at the pizza restaurant, Billy Dunlop had been to a stag night at the Billingham Rugby Club along with the rest of the crazy gang, and as usual they'd booked for a stripper to attend the stag. All of the men were drinking alcohol that night, including Billy, and it's been reported that whilst the stripper was performing for the men, Billy got onto the stage with her and he exposed himself and tried to engage in a sexual act with her, which seemed to really frighten this woman. And as a result of this and the fact that he got into a fight with another man at the club, the doormen threw Billy Dunlop out and forced him to leave. And he was so furious at being thrown out that as he was leaving, he literally headbutted the door, which caused a nasty cut to his eyebrow that bled a lot. And so he actually went to the hospital that night after leaving the club to get stitches in his eyebrow. Dunlop left the hospital at around 1:30 AM on the morning of the 16th of November, so about the same time that Julie was dropped back to her house by her co-worker after her shift. And then following this, the police were struggling to piece together Dunlop's movements for the rest of that night. He didn't have a solid alibi. The police did speak to his friend Don, who, if you remember, Billy was lodging with at the time, very close to Grange Avenue. And interestingly, when the police first spoke to Don, he actually claimed that Billy Dunlop had returned home on the night of Julie's disappearance at around 2 AM and he went straight to bed. However, when the police spoke to Don a second time about this, he changed his story and admitted that actually he wasn't totally truthful in the first statement that he gave. He admitted that Billy wasn't actually home by 2 AM and in fact he had no idea what time it was that Billy returned to the house that night. So now Billy didn't have an alibi for the time that Julie was believed to have been killed. So now that they knew that Billy Dunlop could have had opportunity to carry out this crime, the police decided to conduct searches of the house where Billy was living to see if they could find any evidence in there which connected him to Julie's murder. And guess what they found? Hidden underneath the floorboards in the kitchen of the house, they discovered a set of keys, house keys. It turns out that these keys were Julie Hogg's and they had been missing since her disappearance. The police couldn't find them anywhere in her house, so when she was found murdered, it was clear that her killer had taken the keys away with them, and they were found at Billy Dunlop's address with a couple of Billy's fingerprints on them. But the evidence against him didn't stop there. In addition to the keys and the fingerprints, scientists also discovered traces of semen and also some hairs on the blanket that Julie's body was wrapped in. And when compared against Billy's DNA, whilst DNA technology at this time in 1989 couldn't 100% definitively say that this semen and the hairs had come from him, they were pretty confident that it was a match. It was a partial match, so it more than likely was Dunlop's semen and hairs on the blanket. And of course, the presence of semen strongly indicated that Julie's murder was sexually motivated. And the medical examiner did conclude during Julie's autopsy that there was evidence of a, quote, violent sexual injury to Julie's body, to her genitalia. She had been sexually assaulted by her killer on the night of her death. But speaking of her death, her official cause of death actually remained unclear due to the fact that Julie obviously wasn't found until nearly 3 months after she was killed. The level level of decomposition meant that they couldn't establish exactly how she had been murdered, although the coroner believed that she had most likely died as the result of asphyxiation from being either strangled or suffocated to death. So because of all of this evidence, the police felt that they had enough to both arrest and charge Billy Dunlop with Julie's murder, and so that's exactly what they did. Following his arrest, he was obviously interviewed by detectives. However, he completely denied it. He claimed that he was innocent and that he had nothing to do with the murder of Julie Hogg, so it became clear that this case was headed to trial. Billy Dunlop's trial began in May of 1991, so about a year and a half after Julie's death. The prosecution obviously put forward all of their evidence connecting Dunlop to Julie's case, so for example the semen evidence, the fingerprint evidence, etc. However, the defence's response to this evidence, their explanation was simply that Billy Dunlop had been framed. They claimed that the police had planted Billy's DNA in order to frame him. They planted his fingerprints on Julie's keys and they planted the keys in his house. And they said that all the semen evidence proved was that Billy had had sex with Julie, but that doesn't automatically mean that he was the one who killed her. In addition to that, the defense's tactic was also to essentially launch a character assassination of Julie. They made her out to be this promiscuous, almost irresponsible young woman who had slept with various different men, including Dunlop, after her separation from her husband. They were making her out to be the bad person here, which just makes me so angry. It was almost more like Julie was on trial rather than Dunlop. They were casting these horrible judgments on her, and for what? She was a single adult woman and they were judging her for her choices regarding her sex life as if it was even relevant to her brutal murder. It was like they were trying to blame Julie for her own death, because if she wasn't so promiscuous and careless, maybe this wouldn't have happened to her. Honestly, the fury that defense strategies like this fill me with is insane. It's just victim blaming at the end of the day, isn't it? And it's vile. Billy Dunlop himself took to the stand during the trial. He took to the witness box and of course remained adamant that he was an innocent man and that he would never do anything like this. He would never kill Julie, and he seemed very convincing, to be honest. Even Julie's own mother Anne said that he was very convincing despite the evidence that was stacked against him. And would you believe it, he seemed to be convincing enough that when the jury went off to deliberate, they actually couldn't reach a verdict. They couldn't decide or agree whether or not to find him guilty or not guilty, and so because of this, the judge had to order a retrial. They were going to have to do this whole thing again with a new jury because this jury were just unsure. Julie's family would be forced to endure this whole grueling process a second time. The second trial commenced about 5 months after the first in October of that same year, October of 1991, and tragically it was the exact same outcome. This new jury couldn't reach a verdict either. They couldn't even reach a majority verdict, and because this was the second time now where a jury couldn't make a decision on Dunlop's guilt, the judge of the second trial actually decided to acquit Billy Dunlop, meaning that that was it. He could never go to trial again for Julie's murder. And as you can imagine, Julie's family were just devastated. Her mother Anne collapsed in the courtroom when the judge ordered the acquittal. She started shouting out saying, "He killed our daughter and he's walking free. What's going to happen now?" It was just heartbreaking for the family because they knew that he had done this. They knew that Dunlop was the perpetrator, but he'd gotten away with it. He'd gotten away with murder. Julie was never going to get justice now because of double jeopardy laws in the UK at the time. For those who are unfamiliar with double jeopardy, it basically means that someone who has been found not guilty or acquitted of a crime cannot be prosecuted for that same crime ever again. And this law has been in place for about 800 years in England and Wales. It was in place to essentially prevent the police from abusing the system when a trial has not resulted in the outcome that they wanted. If double jeopardy wasn't a thing, then, you know, what's to stop the police from continually charging and prosecuting prosecuting the same suspect over and over again until they eventually get that guilty verdict. So the law did have its place, but at the same time, there were definitely flaws within it, which we'll come back to a little later on. Following his acquittal, Billy Dunlop actually went on to do a television interview in which he once again maintained his innocence, and he even said that he wanted the police to reopen the case and find the real killer. He gave this TV interview in which he was protesting his innocence, and yet at the same time, what Julie's family would discover was that he was also going around and bragging to people about the fact that he'd gotten away with the quote, perfect murder. Literally just weeks after the second trial ended, Billy Dunlop was overheard by people in the pub boasting and gloating about the fact that he'd gotten away with killing Julie. He was clearly on such a high. He felt invincible because he was a free man after committing the most heinous crime, safe in the knowledge that because of the double jeopardy law, he would never be convicted of Julie's murder now. He could brag all he wanted. He could confess to whoever, knowing full well that now the police couldn't do anything about it. And so he just continued on, carried on with his life as normal without a care in the world for the trauma and devastation he had caused. But the police knew full well that this wouldn't be the last they would hear of Billy Dunlop. As we know, he was an incredibly violent and volatile man who would lash out constantly. So they knew that he would reoffend at some point or another. And it seemed as though that time came in 1997. So this was 6 years after his acquittal, when Billy Dunlop was sent to prison for just a couple of months for threatening to kill his ex-girlfriend, who was also the mother of his children. Her name was Jane. Upon his release from prison for this, he ultimately ended up getting another girlfriend. Her name was Donna. However, they eventually broke up and Donna began a relationship with another man named Sean. And Billy Dunlop was so angry at Donna, so furious that she had left him for another man, that he decided he was going to attack both her and her new boyfriend Sean. He went to her flat and using a baseball bat, he beat Sean viciously around the head, and he was hitting Sean with this bat so hard and with so much force that this wooden bat literally snapped. And using an oven fork, he proceeded to stab Donna several times. Now luckily, both Donna and Sean did survive this attack. They both sustained horrific injuries, mind. One of the stab wounds punctured Donna's lung, and Sean sustained several broken bones in his face, and he had to have facial reconstruction surgery, but they did survive. And the only reason that they survived was because luckily Donna's brother and some of her friends arrived at the flat shortly after the attack began and the police were called. But oh my god, had they not arrived at that exact moment, there's no doubt in my mind that Billy would have gone on to finish the job. He would have made sure that they were dead before he left. Following this horrific assault, Billy Dunlop was arrested and charged with 2 counts of attempted murder, although ultimately he ended up pleading guilty to the lesser charges of wounding with intent to cause grievous bodily harm, which the court accepted frustratingly, and he was sentenced to only 7 years in prison. And sickeningly, whilst he was behind bars for this crime, Dunlop actually sent a letter to Donna in which he threatened that once he was finally let out of prison, he would do to her what he had done to Julie Hogg. He would kill her just like he had killed Julie. So once again, he has literally confessed to Julie's murder, but once again, nothing could be done. Donna immediately gave this letter to the police, but because of double jeopardy, they were still powerless to do anything in regards to Julie's case. But whilst the police knew that Dunlop could never be charged with Julie's murder again, the fact that he had confessed to the crime several times following his acquittal did make them start to wonder whether they could prosecute him for another crime related to Julie's death. Perjury, perhaps. Now, perjury is a criminal offence whereby someone has been proven to have lied under oath as a witness during a court case, which clearly was the case with Dunlop. As we discussed earlier, he stood as a witness during both of his trials for Julie's murder, in which he claimed that he was innocent and that he was not Julie's killer. killer. But now the police had proof that that was a lie. He'd committed perjury. He'd lied under oath because they had his confession to Julie's murder in this letter that he'd sent to Donna. And they had witnesses who had previously overheard him bragging in the pub about how he'd gotten away with the perfect murder. So if they could somehow get even more admissions of guilt in regards to Julie's death from Billy Dunlop himself, if they could build up their case against him, maybe they could prosecute him for perjury. And at the very, very least, get him some prison time for something related to Julie's killer. It would be some very small form of justice for her at least. And so they came up with a plan. You see, they discovered that during his time in prison for obviously trying to kill Donna and Sean, Billy Dunlop had befriended this one particular female prison officer. He grew a liking to her and would chat to her most days. And so they decided to wire up this female prison officer with a secret recording device so that all of her conversations with Billy Dunlop would be on tape. They would be recorded. What they were hoping was that they would obviously capture him confessing to Julie's murder. And their plan worked. Sure enough, during his conversations with the prison officer, he started talking about Julie Hogg and how he was the one responsible for her death. Bingo, the police had what they wanted, and so following these taped confessions, they decided to conduct a recorded interview with Billy Dunlop themselves about the fact that he had committed perjury. The police sat down with him and they asked him about his 2 trials for Julie's murder. They asked, quote, "Did you tell the truth in both your trials?" To which Dunlop admitted no. And so they asked him outright, "Did you kill Julie Hogg?" And Dunlop confessed yes. Sat right opposite the police, he fully admitted that he was in fact Julie's killer, and he told them why he committed the crime. He had no shame in admitting it, even to the police now, because I know I keep saying it, but he knew the law. He knew that he was protected by double jeopardy, and so not only did he confess to the police, he also had no problem with now telling them exactly how he did it, exactly what happened that night. He said that in the early hours of the 16th of November 1989, after his night at the rugby club and after he left the hospital where he received the stitches for the cut to his eyebrow, he decided to go round his friend Mark's house. Now, Mark actually lived right next door to Julie Hogg on Grange Avenue, and Dunlop claimed that when he arrived at Mark's address that night, he was asleep. However, he noticed that the lights in Julie's house were still on, and so he decided to go round and see her. He knocked on Julie's front door and he claimed that she willingly let him inside and that she made him a cup of tea. He said that he and Julie were just chatting for a while. However, he said that he became angry when Julie started, quote, taking the mickey out of him, as he put it. He said that she started mocking him and laughing at him for the stitches in his eyebrow and his black eye, and she was saying that the other guy involved in the fight at the rugby club must have basically won the fight, got the better of him, because Billy looked terrible, and he just saw red. He said that he just lost it, and so he lunged at Julie, grabbed her by the throat and strangled her to death. He wouldn't discuss the sexual assault aspect of the crime with the police, when exactly he sexually assaulted Julie. However, he admitted that he killed her, and then he decided to hide her body under the bath. He took the bath panels off, wrapped her up in the blanket, put her underneath the bath, and then screwed the panels back on. And I think he claimed that the reason he took Julie's house keys was because he did plan to return to the house at some point to move her body elsewhere. But of course, he never did. He probably didn't have a chance to because of all of the police activity and forensics at the scene following Julie's disappearance. And so, following this taped confession, Dunlop was charged with 2 counts of perjury because obviously he'd lied under oath in 2 trials, and he did plead guilty to those charges. Julie's family were hopeful that for this he would get the maximum sentence that one can get for perjury, which is 7 years. So they were hoping that he would get 14 years altogether for the 2 2 counts, and then at least that would be something. However, in the end, he was only actually sentenced to 6 years in prison for perjury. He received 3 years for each charge. So once again, a very, very disappointing result for Julie's loved ones. But Julie's mother, Anne, turned this disappointment and her frustration into determination. She was not willing to give up. She was not going to let this evil, evil man get away with killing her beautiful baby girl. She was going to do whatever it took to get justice for Julie, and Anne knew that to do that, she was going to have to try and change the law. The only way that Billy Dunlop would ever get his comeuppance and face real punishment for murdering her daughter was if there was a change in the double jeopardy laws in the UK. And so Anne decided that if that's what it took, that was what she was going to set out to do. She was going to do everything in her power to get this 800-year-old law changed if it was the last thing she ever did. I actually have a quote here from Anne's book. She wrote a book about her daughter's murder called For the Love of Julie, which I did read during my research of this case. I'll leave a link to her book down in the description box in case anyone else is interested in reading it. But in her book, Anne said, quote, "Once I'd had time to recover a little from the shock of the trial, I decided that there was no way I was going to let this setback stop me from finding a way of getting Dunlop put behind bars to serve a life sentence." Whilst the double jeopardy law did serve some purpose, like for example what I mentioned earlier, preventing the police from retrying the same individual for a crime over and over and over until they get the result that they want during a trial, there was no doubt that there were issues with it too. It didn't make sense to Anne that, you know, an individual could never be prosecuted for the same crime after being acquitted, even when new solid evidence emerged in a case. Like with Billy Dunlop, after his acquittal, he'd literally been going around confessing to Julie's murder, even to the police. And he was so arrogant about it because he knew this double jeopardy law protected him. And how the hell was that fair? How can a cold-blooded killer like Dunlop be allowed to go around admitting to a heinous crime such as this one and still not be prosecuted simply because of this 800-year-old law? It wasn't right. Anne knew that something needed to be done about it. Something needed to change. And so she started campaigning for the change in the law, contacting whoever she needed to who may be able to help her. She reached out to her local MP and the Home Secretary at the time, a man named Jack Straw. She wrote letters to the Law Commission of England and Wales. She reached out to anyone and everyone in a position of power and authority that she thought might be able to help her in her fight. She also did everything that she could to get as much media attention on her campaign as possible. She would do as many TV interviews and radio interviews as she could to try and get as much backing and public support. And she was eventually able to get her campaign all the way to Parliament and the House of Lords. She would attend all of these debates to get her point across on why the law should be changed. And Anne was doing all of this for years and years, by the way. I'm obviously summarising here, but this wasn't a quick process at all. She campaigned tirelessly for years. She never ever gave up, despite the amount of setbacks that she faced. And she obviously goes into a lot more detail about all of this in her book. So again, highly recommend that you guys give it a read. It's incredible. And thankfully, would you believe it, all of Anne's hard work eventually paid off. The law was through. The double jeopardy law was finally changed and enforced in April of 2006, nearly 17 years after Julie was killed. Anne had been campaigning for this for more than a decade and a half, and finally the double jeopardy law was overturned as part of the Criminal Justice Act of 2003. This change meant that offenders like Billy Dunlop could now be charged and retried for the same crime, so long as the police have new and compelling evidence against them, evidence which they didn't have in their original investigation. So for example, new forensic or DNA evidence. And luckily it was decided that this change in the law would be enforced retrospectively, meaning that it wouldn't just qualify in murder cases to come, in future cases. It would also apply to older cases that had happened before the law was overturned, such as Julie's case. So now finally Anne was on track to get her daughter's killer behind bars for good, and thankfully, of course, by the time the double jeopardy law was overturned. The police already had the new and compelling evidence against Billy Dunlop that they needed. They had the evidence of his many confessions over the years. Of course, before they could recharge him, they had to firstly get his original acquittal quashed. So they went to the Court of Appeal in May of 2006, and luckily it was quashed almost immediately, meaning that Billy Dunlop could go to trial for Julie's murder once again, for the third time. So he was charged, and at his plea hearing at the Old Bailey Court in London, he initially pleaded not guilty once again. However, would you believe it, he later changed this and decided to in fact plead guilty this time. I mean, he wasn't stupid. He knew that the evidence was stacked up against him now. They literally had his confessions, his detailed confessions to Julie's murder on tape. There was no way that a jury would not convict him now with this evidence if he was to go through with the third trial. And so clearly he thought, might as well plead guilty and hope for a lesser sentence. And in October of 2006, nearly 17 years after the crime, Billy Dunlop was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 17 years for the murder of 22-year-old Julie Hogg. Billy Dunlop was the first man in Britain to be retried for the same crime in 800 years. This case made history in the UK, and it was all thanks to Julie's mother, Anne. Without her, Julie never would have got justice for her horrific death. But not only that, but other families of murder victims wouldn't have gotten justice either. Like Cassandra McDermott's family. I covered Cassandra's case a couple of months ago on my channel, and initially her killer, her ex-boyfriend Mario Soler, was found not guilty of her murder. But it was thanks to this case, thanks to the change in the double jeopardy law that Anne campaigned for, which meant that Mario Soler could eventually be retried, and he was finally convicted for killing Cassandra and sent to prison. The change in the double jeopardy law has made such a huge difference in so many cases. I just think that Anne Ming should be so incredibly proud of herself. What an incredible woman she is, what a queen. And luckily she was recognised for her hard work. In October of 2007, she was awarded an MBE at Buckingham Palace by King Charles. Just for an update on Julie's son Kevin too, obviously Kevin was literally only 3 years old when his mother was murdered, and so tragically he has no memory of his mum at all. He obviously has photographs of her and photographs of him with her as a baby, but that's it. He has no recollection of her because he was so young when she was taken away from him. And actually throughout his childhood, the decision was made by his father Andrew, by Julie's ex-husband, not to tell Kevin exactly how his mum had died. He didn't want to tell Kevin that she had been murdered, and so instead the family told him that Julie had died as the result of a tragic accident whereby she slipped and hit her head after getting out of the bath. It wasn't until his teenage years, I don't believe, when he finally found out the truth, because he started hearing rumours going around his school. Other kids would come up to him in school and tell him that his mother hadn't been killed from hitting her head, she'd actually been murdered. And so it was at this point when his father and the rest of the family decided that it was time for Kevin to be told what really happened, which must have just been awful for him. I mean, I completely get why they chose to keep it a secret from him for so long, but it must have been horrible for him to have found out through his peers at school how his mum had really died. And of course, for him to have grown up without her, he was robbed of all of those years, all those memories that he could have made with his mum because of an evil killer who chose to take her away, take her life. And in fact, it's actually believed that Julie's life may not have been the only one that Billy Dunlop stole. He is also considered a suspect in the murder of another young woman, a woman named Tina Bell. Tina Bell was just 18 years old when she disappeared on the 2nd of June 1989, so literally only a couple of months before Julie Hogg was killed. That night, Tina was camping out in a tent with her younger brother John in the garden of her parents' house. Her parents lived on Crescent Avenue in Billingham, and at one point that evening, Tina left the house to go to the local shop. She decided that she was going to go and buy some sweets for her and John for their camping adventure in the garden. However, Tina never returned after leaving to go to the shop. She never made it back home. She just disappeared. And the truth surrounding her disappearance remained a mystery for more than 10 months until finally in April of 1990, her skeletal remains were found by two young boys who were shooting clay pigeons on this wasteland area not too far from Tina's home. And what the police would eventually come to learn was that one of the last people that Tina Bow was seen alive with was none other than Billy Dunlop. She was last seen in a flat with Dunlop along with a couple of other men who have also been considered suspects in Tina's case. But despite an extensive police investigation, Billy Dunlop has never been definitively linked to Tina's murder. And to this day, more than 3.5 decades later, tragically, Tina's case still remains unsolved. I feel like I could do a whole separate video on Tina's case because there is so much more to it than I've obviously mentioned now, so do let me know if you would like to see that at some point. But yeah, many people believe that Dunlop probably had more victims like Tina Bow, and maybe others that we just don't even know about yet. As for where Billy Dunlop himself currently is today he is around like 60 years old, and of course his 17-year minimum sentence for Julie's murder has come to an end now. That ended just last year in 2023, and he was actually supposed to have a parole hearing just a couple of weeks ago in June of 2024, where it was to be decided what would happen to him, whether he would remain in a normal prison, whether he would be transferred to an open prison, or whether he would be released. However, this parole hearing was subsequently delayed by the Ministry of Justice, and at the time that I'm filming this video, I believe it is still waiting to be rescheduled. So an update regarding his prisoner status, I suppose, could come out any day now. So I will keep you guys updated on that in the comments. I, for one, hope to God that he is not let out of prison. I personally think that he poses way too much of a threat to the public to even be considered for release, but I guess that decision isn't up to me, so we'll see. But that concludes this case. That is the case of Julie Hogg. A very, very, very tragic story indeed, but at least something so positive came out of Julie's horrific murder, the change in the double jeopardy law. As I said before, if it wasn't for Anne Ming, other families of murder victims would probably still be waiting for justice to this day had the law not been overturned. So that is an incredible lasting legacy for Julie, and I'm sure that she would be so incredibly proud of the amazing work that her mum has achieved. But yeah, that is it for this case. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case down below in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think, and also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. They can be solved cases, unsolved cases, serial killer cases, you name it. Again, you can pop them in the comments down below, or alternatively, I do have a case request form linked in the description box if you would like to go through that. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye!